British monarchy is a racist colonial institution, and it shouldn't exist.
We're seeing a 2-to-1 margin of Canadians who are saying, I think long-term we're done with the monarchy versus those who say keep it.
We want a New Zealander as head of state, but that actually doesn't mean leaving the Commonwealth. Most of the members of the Commonwealth these days are actually republics and have their own heads of state.
So the first speaker that we have is a Greens senator from Australia, Senator Mehreen Faruqi, and I'm going to, sorry, hold on one second. And I'm just going to ask Mehreen to say a few words as a way of opening up this particular session, and then we'll introduce some other panelists, including Professor Jenny Hocking from Australia as well, who some of you would have seen speak before, Lewis Holden, Chair of Republic New Zealand, and Tom Frieda, Chair of Citizens for Canadian Republic. So firstly, welcome, Mehreen. Thank you very much for joining us. I know it's quite late in the evening where you are, and maybe I'll just hand over to you and we'll hear what you have to say, and then we'll get on with the conversation after that.
Yeah, thanks, Graham, and thank you very much for inviting me. Good afternoon, everyone. I acknowledge the sovereign owners of the land on which I live and work, who are the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to elders, past and present. This land is, always was, and always will be Aboriginal land. Thank you so much for having me today at the opening session of the International Anti-Monarchy Conference, and it is exciting to bear witness and be part of this growing movement to dismantle the British monarchy. When I spoke out about the Queen's Jubilee in the Australian Senate in February this year and described the British monarchy as a relic of the British Empire, which shouldn't exist, I was actually very surprised by the wave of public support that I received, not just from Australia, but across the world, including the UK. So it's clear that an international movement is getting bigger and louder. And as I said then, it is my view that the British monarchy is a racist colonial institution. The violent legacies of British colonialism are felt by people in countries all across the globe. Many countries formerly occupied by British colonialists suffer to this day from poverty, corruption, malnutrition, and conflict introduced by the colonizer. And this is no accident. In Pakistan, where I grew up, conflicts still exist due to the arbitrary borders drawn up by British colonists to maintain their divide and rule mentality. We know that generations of Kashmiris have grown up without the most basic of human rights, to live and to live in peace. So when I immigrated to Australia in the early 1990s, I was introduced to yet another country that had been torn apart by British colonial rule. British imperialist forces violently tried to erase First Nations people's ownership of this land, declaring Australia terra nullius, nobody's land. This land was violently stolen from First Nations people when the British invaded Australia in 1788. And since then, they have been murdered, had their families separated, children stolen, land and water destroyed, all at the hands of the colonial state. And that oppression, discrimination, and racism lives on in the structures of government and society. Colonized people know that they and their ancestors had to fight tooth and nail the cruel, racist, and extractivist rule of the British Empire to finally get rid of them. But the institution of the monarchy continues to infest the world in many different ways under the guise of globalized trade and imperialist corporations. But more and more people are realizing this. Millions of people are marching to make Black Lives Matter. People are tearing down statues of slave owners, and conversations about decolonizing systems and movements are gathering pace. And I'm really heartened by this movement for global justice. Last year, Barbados became a republic. Since then, 6 other Caribbean countries announced that they too were planning on cutting ties from their colonial oppressors. So more and more of us are waking up to the crimes of the British royal family and wanting to cut ties with the British monarchy. I mean, heck, even Prince Harry and Meghan Markle have severed their ties with the royals. You might know that Australia held a referendum over 20 years ago in 1999 on whether we should be a republic. That referendum failed, with 45% of Australians supporting change. And since then, the republic movement has been relatively quiet. However, recent polls suggest that support is growing, and data published at the start of this year suggested that 54% of Australians were willing to vote for a republic. The newly elected Labor government, just elected a couple of weeks ago, has appointed an assistant minister for the republic, the first time that this has ever happened. And this move can be seen as a positive step towards Australia cutting ties with the British monarchy. Becoming a republic is an important step in achieving racial justice on this continent. However, any move towards a republic cannot be done without truth-telling about Australia's bloody colonial past, delivering justice to First Nations people, a recognition of First Nations sovereignty, a treaty, and delivering on the Uluru Statement from the heart. The British monarchy is losing its relevance year on year, and I think it's safe to say that it is inevitable that Australia will become a republic. However, a republic which cuts the apron strings from the British monarchy must be one which is decolonized and based on sovereignty for First Nations. To capture the hearts and minds of Australians in the 2020s, Republicans have to ensure that this campaign is proudly anti-racist and speaks the truth about the British Crown, its atrocities and legacies. Australia was built on stolen land, and there can be no justice without First Nations justice. So it is up to all of us to make the case for change and to continue to organize and advocate for democracy and justice. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Maureen. That was brilliant. Do you think that all the issues that have come up in the Caribbean over the last few weeks, particularly in relation to the two visits, has that kind of sparked a debate about race and reconciliation, reparations and so on in Australia?
That debate actually has started, I think 5 years ago in earnest, after the Uluru Statement from the heart, and it's just getting bigger and louder. Absolutely.
Can you tell us a bit about that statement from the heart? Because I don't know that it's gotten a lot of coverage over here.
So this is when a few hundred or First Nations leaders and communities got together and basically developed the statement, which is about truth-telling, justice, and a voice to Parliament. So basically, all these leaders, and I have to mention that there isn't 100% consensus amongst First Nations communities that, in terms of the priorities of the various recommendations of the Uluru Statement from the heart, but it is about truth-telling, it is about treaties, and it is about a voice to Parliament, which is within the Constitution, which is basically an advisory body. It's not clear at the moment what it exactly will look like, but the new Labor government has committed to having a referendum, which we need to do to change the Constitution for that voice.
And Jenny Hocking and Tom Frieda, welcome to the conference. We're just waiting for Lewis to join us now. And Jenny, obviously we've got a new Australian government. Do you think that that's now going to put the Republic issue back on the agenda? People have said that they haven't made a lot of commitment to it, but there is an announcement of a junior minister for the Republic. So do you think it's going to happen in maybe the second term of an Albanese government?
Well, hello, Graham, and hello, everybody. Thank you very much for inviting me today. It's absolutely terrific. Great to see so many people as part of a worldwide effort to end the monarchy and move to republics. Yes, Graham, it most definitely has put the Republic back on the agenda. It was a little bit of a sleeper in the election campaign. It was not a strongly pushed position, but it is a position the Labor Party, which now forms government, and the new Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, has had within the Labor Party for some time. It's an interesting shift, as Maureen noted, that previously at the last election, Labor went to that election very strongly saying there would be a Republic referendum, they would work towards that. What has happened in the intervening 3 years is that move to recognise the Uluru Statement from the heart, which is so critical in our polity at the moment, has really become a firm commitment from the Labor Party. And quite rightly, I think they have said that that must be done first, and that constitutional recognition of Indigenous peoples through a constitutionally acknowledged voice to the Australian Parliament is a really important step, and that is to be the referendum that they will focus on as a government in the first term. However, for the very first time in our history, we now have an assistant minister for the Republic, and a very strong commitment soon after he took office from the Prime Minister Albanese that they would be looking towards forming another Republic referendum in the second term of government, should they win that second term. So we're looking at a move to actually start the process of moving to a referendum, I suppose, within the next 5 or so years. And it's interesting that that's coincided almost to the day with the Queen's Platinum Jubilee celebrations. And that's been taken over really by the discussions, or side by side. We have a rather bizarre spectacle of the Queen's Jubilee, some very, I have to say, mild celebrations here, absolutely nothing like the extraordinary coverage that we're seeing in Britain at the moment. And around that, of course, you do get a question about, well, the Queen's reign is clearly coming to an end. There's an inevitable prospect of succession to King Charles. And I think it does make people in Australia think, well, we'll wake up one day, probably fairly soon, and we will have a new head of state, King Charles III of Australia, over whom we will have had no choice, no say, and absolutely no involvement, a purely dynastic monarchical succession. And in a country that rests on a liberal democracy, a Westminster system, of course, that really doesn't sit well in Australia as it moves forward at the moment. And I think that's the point at which what is a growing support for a republic is going to really get a very strong push.
And hi to Lewis and to Tom as well. And thank you, Jenny. We'll sort of go around the panel and then sort of open it up to conversation. And all of you feel free to jump in, and then we'll start taking some questions. Lewis, I was going to ask you, because I'll come to Tom in a minute about big shifts in polling, but is it making a difference in New Zealand? Has there been a lot of debate following the royal tours in the Caribbean or following the election of the Albanese government?
Well, certainly the royal tours in the Caribbean, obviously with the outcome that they had, created a little bit of debate. But certainly the election of the Albanese government in Australia has really lit a fire under the debate here. I mean, there's been a whole bunch of media requests to myself and interviews and various other people making comment. We, unfortunately, do tend to look at what the Australians do. And we'd very much like to beat them to this as well. But of course, that's for the New Zealand public to decide via referendum. Our challenge has always been that while we've got governments that have been very in favour of becoming a republic since the 90s, there's only really been a couple that have actually made concrete steps in that direction. The current government, the current Labor-led government here by Jacinda Ardern, is very much in favour of change. And they seem to be simply just waiting for the right moment to do that. And that seems to be around the inevitable end of the current monarch's reign. They think that that's when they'll make their move. So I suspect that we'll see a bit of a fire being lit under them now, with the Albanese government making very clear movements in that direction, and potentially a referendum in the next 3 to 5 years.
And has there been a shift in polling? Because it seems to sort of move around a little bit. I don't think it's been solidly in favour of a republic, has it? Or has that changed?
Yeah, it comes and goes. So in the last sort of 10 years, there has been some quite strong polls in favour of a republic. Most recently, and I suspect this is as a result of the Platinum Jubilee coverage, it's actually dropped down a little bit. But there's a number of other factors as well that seem to come into play. Brexit, for some odd reason, had a major impact on polling here, but support for Republic actually went up after Brexit and stayed consistently up for a while. So it's a hard one to actually put your finger on exactly what is driving public perceptions around this issue. We know that there is a very strong feeling amongst many New Zealanders that we have to keep links to the Commonwealth, which I suspect is a product of being a smaller country, sort of on the periphery of things. And so what we find is when you talk about the fact that the majority of members of the Commonwealth these days are republics, and countries like Barbados have made that transition and have their own head of state now, and we'll still be sending a team to Birmingham to the 2022 Commonwealth Games. People sort of say, yeah, we get that. We understand that we actually get the best of both worlds if we become a republic. So that message is a very important one. We know that that's worth at least around 10% in support if people understand that we don't lose the Commonwealth link.
And that's, I think that's a point, Tom, that has come up in Canada as well. And I was seeing the clip that we used in the video just then. There seems to have been a big shift in Canada in terms of polling. I mean, it used to be the case that Canada was considered one of the most loyal realms, as they'd say. But now there's a majority in favour of getting rid of the monarchy. Is that right? You're muted, Tom.
There we go. You got me okay?
Yep.
I've been doing this for over 20 years, and there has never been, as long as I've been doing this, an opinion poll that showed a majority of Canadians in favor of keeping the monarchy. While there's been more that favor keeping the monarchy than having a republic, if you combine those who just don't care one way or the other, plus those who want a republic, it's always been those on our side that have been on the top of the polls. But lately, the most damning opinion poll, there have been two in a row that show somewhere around a quarter of Canadians want to keep the monarchy after the Queen's reign ends. That's pretty damning opinion polls. And of course, everything that has been said so far about the Commonwealth and making the argument that not much has to change, that everything that we like about our ties to the royal family don't have to be affected. Our parliamentary traditions don't change. Canada, for all intents, is already a parliamentary republic with the Governor General doing everything that a presidential ceremonial head of state does. That's been the hardest job, actually, has been countering the monarchist propaganda that says that the wheels are going to come off the Canadian Federation if we do this, and that it means abolishing the crown, it means leaving the Commonwealth, it means hurting the Queen's feelings. There are all kinds of arguments that have come up, and our goal for the past 20 years has been to step up for the media and dispel all those myths, and make the argument for what a growing number of Canadians are believing, and that is that this isn't about whether we like the royals or whether we dislike Prince Charles or whether, I'll admit that the colonialism aspect is quite prominent, and decolonizing and Black Lives Matter, and Barbados going through with their goal of becoming a republic. Those have all been very, very important factors. But all along, it's been about, if Canada is an independent country, we deserve to have our own head of state who we choose independently from our own. And that's the message that we press. We even in the media, if we're called anti-monarchists, we say, well, some of us are, but you don't have to be an anti-monarchist to wish that Canada had its own head of state. Yep. You can like following the royals. You can enjoy the Platinum Jubilee. You can show up when the royals come and visit. Yep. None of that has to change.
And there is
what we do think is that Canada it's the 21st century, and it's time for Canada to have its own head of state.
Absolutely. And I would say, just to comment briefly on what Jenny said about what it might look like from overseas about the Jubilee celebrations over here. There's been lots of photos of empty streets and unattended events around the country. So the BBC is not doing you was doing you a disservice in the way that they're projecting this this celebration. It is down considerably in terms of the level of interest. Maureen, the Commonwealth, do you think that's something which, I mean, I know that speaking to Tom and Lewis in the past, but particularly that some of the campaigns are very keen to say, look, we'll stay in the Commonwealth. Do you think the Commonwealth is still important to Australia? Do you think it's important to any of the Commonwealth countries?
I think probably in Australia, maybe Jenny could speak more on this. I think the view on the Commonwealth would be pretty similar to what Tom said about Canada. I mean, from my perspective, like I said, I grew up in Pakistan, and Pakistan became a republic in 1956. So this is something, you know, that before even I was born happened. And Pakistan's no longer in the Commonwealth either, you know. So, you know, my view could be a little bit different from, you know, what the community thinks, but I do think that the feeling is that we need our own head of state, exactly like Canada. But like I emphasized earlier, Graham, from where I sit, I think this has to happen hand in hand with First Nations justice. In Australia, given how much violence, dispossession occurs, and I think Australia is a little bit different from Pakistan and some of the other countries who actually have become republics, in the sense that it is still a settler colonial state. The colonists never left this country. So I think that is one of the reasons why it has taken us so long as well to make a move towards a republic and towards justice for First Nations.
Yep. And absolutely. And I think I get the sense, certainly from afar, that Australia is making progress in terms of the level and reaction to debate about First Nation justice and so on. It's certainly, I mean, I lived there a long time ago now, 20 years ago. It didn't seem to be particularly something that white Australia took particularly to heart. But there are, of course, a number of other issues. And I feel I need to ask Jenny about the constitutional issues, because you've done, we've talked about this before, this long fight for the letters. I mean, there is, and I'll ask the other speakers to comment on this. There is a constitutional aspect to this, isn't there, in terms of the role of the Governor General and their relationship with the Queen, and obviously that a lot of that came to a head in 1975. Can you just sort of tell us a little bit about what happened there and what you've done, or what's happened since?
Well, absolutely. There's a really significant constitutional issue, which is why this question of a republic has to take the form of a referendum in order to change the constitution. But in 1975, of course, the Governor-General, Queen's representative in Australia, dismissed for the first and only time, and let's hope it is the only time, an elected government from office without warning, and replaced them by the party that had lost the previous two elections to take office. It was an extraordinary event. The dismissal of the Whitlam governor was certainly an animating feature in my interest in both the nature of parliamentary democracy and Australian political history in general. And it's one that I think our understanding of has never been fully resolved, in very large part because so much of it has been hidden from us. And much of that history was hidden from us in our own National Archives in Canberra. And when I was researching Gough Whitlam's biography, and then after that work on the dismissal, which I undertook over the last decade or so, to my astonishment, there were packages of letters between the Queen and the Governor-General at that time, which were closed to the Australian people on the embargo of the Queen. So we're often told always told really, that the monarch has no real political power. The monarch is politically neutral, and that's really the defining feature of a constitutional monarch. They do not get involved in political matters. They stay aloof. They're not involved. We were always told, even as recently as 2 years ago, that the Queen and the palace knew nothing about the pending dismissal of the by the Governor-General of the government of the day. Now, what the letters show very clearly is that that is not the case. The Governor-General had been in touch with the Queen for several weeks prior to the dismissal, and had, as he called it, received advice from her private secretary on dismissal. So it's been a massive outcome in Australia, which took a court case to lift the Queen's embargo. So it's simply wrong to suggest that the Queen has no real power, that the monarch has no real power in very clear and precise areas. And one of those, unfortunately, is in that very ambiguous and yet extremely powerful element of the so-called reserve powers of the Crown, and as they're exercisable by our Governor-General. Now, what that means for a republic going forward is that the way in which we cast the powers of the new head of state is always going to be a very controversial one. Are we going to retain what are still now in our circumstance, but perhaps not in other Commonwealth countries, seen as very powerful reserve powers, precisely because our Governor-General exercised them? Or are we simply going to make a break from a monarch to a new form of head of state? So there's a lot of thinking to be done. And I saw that one of the questions online was, well, what does the Albanese government have to do over the next term in order to get this ready? I think that's really the nub of this question. What are the powers going to be? What is the model going to be?
Yeah. So talking of questions, Matt.
Yes. That's going to be my first question. Actually, I just wondered, as we're in this new moment in Australia with the election of Anthony Albanese, whether we could just have a quick moment on what sort of Maureen and Jenny, from your perspective, what you would like to see from the Albanese sort of government over the first term of his prime ministership. Jenny, to you, I think let's probably start with that. What would you like to see from Anthony Albanese in his first term, in terms of republicanism?
In terms of, there's a couple of things. I think, as Maureen has made really clear, and I totally agree, that absolutely vital that the Uluru Statement from the heart is implemented in full, and the government has committed to doing that. And they made that very clear during the election campaign. And they made that very clear again in fact in the victory speech on the night of the election result. And that, in a way, I think it forms a really important starting point for what we then move towards a full autonomy, if you like, with the Republic in the second term, should that come about. But I think taking it into a second term is also really important because of the failure of the 1999 Republican referendum. It founded not because most people didn't want a republic. Funnily enough, and this is this absolutely bizarre situation, most opinion polls showed that by a narrow majority, most Australians wanted us to be a republic. And we had a referendum and didn't end up with one. And that was because of a very cynical political division that was created in the form of the form that the appointment of that new head of state, whether it be president or whatever, would be done. Would it be an appointment of the Parliament, or would it be by popular election? And it's so ironic, given that we have absolutely no choice on the selection of our head of state at the moment, and yet we're still arguing about how we ought to be able to appoint them when we can. So that's the first point, is that to succeed with referenda in Australia, you have to have cross-party support, or at least good bipartisan support with crossbenchers, and we've got a very strong crossbench now in the Parliament. So there has to be that political agreement, there has to be an agreement on a model, and there has to be an educative process, I think, in which things like the fact that we can still remain in the Commonwealth are made very, very clear. And for all of those reasons, I think the government, and I hope the government, will be working towards laying a very strong groundwork so that the referendum does not fail a second time.
Great.
I think Jenny has pretty much captured everything that I was going to say as well. So thanks very much, Jenny.
Thank you.
That was perfect. That was perfect.
I've got a question. I've got a question which is really for all the panelists as members of the Commonwealth, which is you're more likely to gain gain republic status before we do here in the UK. And the question really is, will you be able to assist us when you gain it, or will you leave us all straggling here behind?
We're always helping you out, aren't we?
what can be done as a collective unit to help make the case for republicanism here? I think that's the case.
I think probably the main thing is that, I mean, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, we're all parliamentary democracies. And in fact, actually, a large part of the reason why we are parliamentary democracies, as Tom will tell you, is because the Canadians got up in arms at some stage in the 1830s. In fact, one of the fellows who was involved in that ended up migrating to New Zealand and started a newspaper here, and one of our first MPs. So that sort of tradition, and he was a Republican as well. Samuel Revens was his name. That sort of tradition was exported, if you will, to the, for want of a better term, white settler colonies. So we all have very similar systems of government, in the Westminster tradition. So I think that's a big help in the way that you can quite easily point to, examples of constitutional systems where what we're proposing works, and it works very well. Of course, there's another example, if you look on a map, which is also very close to you, which is, of course, the Republic of Ireland, who has a ceremonial head of state and largely follows the Westminster style of parliamentary democracy as well. So I think there's that. The other thing I would say as well is, and I had a little bit of experience of this, although didn't quite get over the line, is with the referendum process. And I think it's pretty much universal that we accept, being good Republicans, of course, that any change should be made through consent of the governed, and therefore that implies that we'll have these referendum processes. I think that will be a very useful piece of learning for everyone involved in these campaigns, because from my own experience, you actually learn a heck of a lot about what works, a lot of what doesn't work, unfortunately. And that becomes very useful knowledge to then share around with everyone, because campaigning in a democracy is not simply about, unfortunately, having the strongest arguments. It's also about getting to the people that need to be convinced, and to show them that what you're proposing is not, pie in the sky stuff. It's actually realistic and can be achieved. I would say, actually, for New Zealand's point, that constitutionally, actually, for us, it's actually quite straightforward. Legally speaking, we actually don't need to hold a referendum. The New Zealand Parliament could actually just pass an act saying we abolish the monarchy. Thanks very much. Governor General's now our head of state. Of course, we've always said that we want a referendum because that's the right thing to do. And as I said, we believe in consent of the governed, etc. So having a democratic process is actually the ideal for this, and affirming that consent. So from our perspective, actually, New Zealand's in the best position constitutionally, and we actually think that one of the reasons why we may end up becoming a republic is not necessarily because we're going to abolish the monarchy, but because we want to create our own written constitution, which we currently don't have. So that's potentially an alternative path to where other people will work. But again, that's specifically for Britain, a piece of knowledge, something that you guys could potentially see and learn from, because of course the kingdom doesn't have a written constitution either.
And Tom, just briefly, because time is getting on, but I understand it's a little bit more complicated in Canada because there needs to be unanimity amongst provinces. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's the general consensus among constitutional experts, that in order to change the office of the Queen, you need unanimous approval of all the provinces. However, you all went through the succession to the throne thing about 7-8 years ago. We now have a Succession to the Throne Act in Canada that did change the office of the Queen without using that amending formula. And it was done by our conservative Harper government, which was probably the most monarchist government going at the time. And it wanted to avoid a constitutional debate on the monarchy. So it ran this through Parliament, and it was contested in court. So ironically, they actually made it easier to remove the monarchy in Canada, because it's only the powers of the office of the Queen that are affected by this amending formula. And so Up until then, leading constitutional experts actually said it's easier for Britain to remove the monarchy than it is in Canada, because all you need is a parliamentary vote. We have to go through an extra process with all our legislators.
Yeah.
But if you take that into account, it kind of pokes holes in the theory that it really is difficult, that it could be easy. And then if you do use the amending formula, look at popular opinion. I don't understand how monarchists can say that the general public is so against the monarchy, as polls say, but our parliamentarians aren't. So I do believe that our parliamentarians have the same opinion, and that if we do go to this amending formula, that it would be successful. And I do believe that it's something that's going to happen on the Queen's demise. And as far as advice from Canada to the United Kingdom on how to proceed after we do this, you have to get popular opinion up. Right now, I understand sentiment to remove the monarchy in the UK is somewhere around 25-30%. Somewhere, is that pretty close?
Yeah, it is shifting in our favor. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, it does. Absolutely, that is absolutely right. And like in New Zealand, we don't need to have a constitutional referendum, but we'll probably end up having one anyway, because I think that's probably not a bad idea.
Graham, could I just say something? Sorry.
Yeah.
Could I just pop in and say something very quickly? I'm just reading some of the comments that have come through about the Greens Party of England having a very strong position on this in terms of anti-monarchist position. And people are saying the Greens are most likely to put their head above the parapet. So in response to your earlier questions on a question on how we can help, very happy to work with the campaigners on the ground in the UK. And I'm very proud to be part of a party who is always kind of putting things on the political and public agenda, which others don't have the courage to do.
Absolutely, because I mean, you're from the Australian Greens, which also had a very good result in the recent election.
Absolutely.
I was going to I'll come back to you actually for one final closing comment, I think, Maroon, but it was suggested to me that if we got rid of the monarchy before Australia, Canada, and New Zealand, that might leave you in a slight quandary, but I'm not quite sure what that does constitutionally for you. But Maureen, are you optimistic about both the movement for republics around the Commonwealth, but also what you were saying earlier about that being tied up with anti-racism and justice for Indigenous populations? I mean, it's been very much part of the debate in relation to the Caribbean tours, in relation to the visit to Canada by Prince Charles, and of course now in Australia. Are you optimistic that these things will all come to a head, and that justice will be seen to be done, be felt to be done by Indigenous people, and also that we will see a monarchy-free Commonwealth?
Absolutely. I am absolutely hopeful and optimistic, because I have seen that movement grow. And, you know, after this election, we actually have more First Nations people in Parliament. We have more people of color in Parliament than we've ever had before. So I think we have kind of reached a little bit of a tipping point at the moment in Australia. Yeah, I think it's going to happen sooner rather than later. Obviously, there is a long way to go for justice for First Nations still, just because it has been going on for more than 200 years, you know, the oppression and the discrimination and, you know, the killings and oppression of First Nations people, and that needs to be reversed. But more and more people are talking about it. The voices are getting louder. We have now those voices right there in the center of Parliament, and things will shift. Absolutely.
Excellent. Well, that's a good positive note. We have kept these sessions relatively tight, and we're going to move on in a moment. But a huge thank you to all of you, Senator Maureen Faruqi, Professor Jenny Hocking, Lewis Holden, and Tom Frieda. It's been fantastic to have you all take part in this debate, and we will see you plenty of times in the future, I'm sure. And I know that everybody's applauding, even though we can't hear them on these online things. But I know it's loud and enthusiastic. So thank you very much for taking part, and we will we'll definitely see you again in the future.
Thank you so much for inviting us. Absolute pleasure.
Thanks, Graham.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Kia ora.
Goodbye, everybody.